Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. I'm the author of the Tanyman Academy series, and this is English Nerd. So I'm sure, especially if you've been around the channel for a while, you know that I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. There are the banners back there, for example. I don't talk a ton about Lord of the Rings on my channel, but it's definitely come up. A few months ago I showed my entire Lord of the Rings collection, which is pretty, impressive. But today, even though I'm a couple days late for Hobbit Day, I know Hobbit Day was September 22nd and I'm filming this the weekend after, I wanted to share with you 10 facts about Lord of the Rings that you may or may not have known, even if you are a fan of Lord of the Rings already. Now, you might know that this is the moment when Viggo Mortensen broke his toe when they were filming Lord of the Rings.
So he boots this helmet. And then he let out this scream. I thought, wow, this is strong. I mean, this is like Aragorn is like just in total grief at what's just happened to Merry and Pippin.
But I doubt that you know all of these. So, in no particular order, here are 10 things that I've learned about Lord of the Rings that I think are pretty fascinating, and I hope for any fans of the books and movies out there that these will be pretty interesting to you as well. So, number one is that parts of The Lord of the Rings are actually Macbeth fan fiction, essentially. So in Shakespeare's Macbeth, there is a series of prophecies, and Macbeth acts on those prophecies, and ultimately it causes his downfall. Now, when Tolkien was young, he went to a production of Macbeth, and he got so excited because there's a set of 3 prophecies at one point, and 2 of them, the ones that feature in Lord of the Rings in a certain way, are no man born of woman can kill you. That's the first one. And then Macbeth will not be defeated until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, so the forest comes to the castle. And so young Tolkien thought, ooh, this is going to be so good, so interesting, and then he just was incredibly disappointed with the way that those 2 prophecies turned out. Now, since he wrote his own book, you guys know that he took those similar ideas and instead twisted them into a more satisfactory conclusion. So you have no man can kill me, I am no man, and it's Éowyn. And then you have also the forest of Fangorn in the shape of the Ents coming and attacking Orthanc. So that is fact number 1. Number 2 is where Gandalf's name came from. A lot of people think that the Tolkien essentially made up all of the names in his books, but that is not the case. If you look at the Catalogue of Dwarves section of the Elder Edda, which is this incredibly old epic poem, there is a list of dwarf names, and then in the middle of them, and they all kind of make sense together. In fact, most of them Tolkien used for all of the hobbits, or not the hobbits, the dwarf names, Ori and Nori, and all those in The Hobbit. So all these names kind of make sense together, philologically, linguistically. But then there's Gandalf right in the middle, which comes from 2 words that means elf with a staff. And so Tolkien wondered, well, what is this name that doesn't actually fit all the rest of them doing in this catalog of dwarves? And so he took the name Gandalf, and that became, Gandalf, and then used a bunch of the other names for the dwarves. So yeah, he didn't come up with those himself exactly. He took existing works, and he did this a lot. He took existing works and kind of made it make sense in this mythical prehistory that he was creating for Europe in the Lord of the Rings and the other, the Silmarillion, all that backstory he was working on. Okay, next in no particular order thing is the Sackville Bagginses. The Sackville Bagginses are actually kind of an inside joke for him. Now, in order to understand the joke, you have to appreciate that Tolkien was very much about English history, and was not a big fan of the French. He felt like the Battle of Hastings, when the Norman French came over and took over from the Anglo-Saxons, that it was this great loss. More on that later. But the word cul-de-sac actually in French means bag end. And so Bag End, the home where Bilbo and Frodo live, is like the anglicized version of that. And then you have these bad relatives who are trying to get Bag End, and they're the Sackville Bagginses. They're kind of like the French, the cul-de-sac, the French relatives that are trying to move in. So kind of dorky, but everybody puts in their own little personal Easter eggs, I think, when they write a book. Okay, number 4 is that, of course, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were friends. If you're watching this, there's a good chance that you already know that. But they met on a regular basis with some other people in this group called the Inklings and shared their work. Now, Tolkien didn't really like C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia very much. He thought that it didn't really make sense that there would be a lamppost in the middle of this fantasy wood. What is Father Christmas doing there? And C.S. Lewis did not really like Tolkien's work because it took Tolkien 14 years to write Lord of the Rings, spanning over the 2 world wars. I mean, it was this huge undertaking. I guess the Second World War was the one when he was writing Lord of the Rings specifically. But so Lewis got really uptight about all these rewrites of people traveling and elves doing things, and he really didn't like Lord of the Rings at all until the book came out in its entirety, and then he read it from cover to cover, and he finally understood the vision of what Tolkien was trying to do, and he wrote this famous glowing review where he said, "Here are beauties that pierce like swords and burn like cold iron." I mean, it's some of the most beautiful turns of phrase used to describe Lord of the Rings that I've certainly ever heard. Okay, next on my list, going back to the Battle of Hastings. So the Battle of Hastings happened in 1066. Again, that's when William the Conqueror, the Norman from France, came over with his army and took over all of the Anglo-Saxon controlled England, and it really shifted the power balance, and it changed our language to be more Frenchified, and all these different things happen. So Tolkien had this private theory that if the Anglo-Saxons had also had a cavalry with horses, then they actually would have had a fighting chance against the Norman French, who did have a cavalry. So the French came in with all these horses. They basically just mowed everybody down, and the Anglo-Saxon English didn't really stand much of a chance because they didn't have that ability. So, of course, when you look at Rohan, their culture is essentially Anglo-Saxon culture, but with horses at the center. One thing that I didn't add on here, but also kind of has to do with horses, is that in World War I, Tolkien actually had the job of breaking horses, because World War I was the last major war with a cavalry. So again, once again, we have this kind of fan fiction version for him of a culture that could have withstood the Normans when they attacked. Okay, next is that in the 60s, the Beatles, of course, were very popular. Tolkien didn't really like them because he didn't really like modern things of any kind. But the Beatles were huge fans of Lord of the Rings, as were many other people at the time. And they wanted to star in a movie version of Lord of the Rings. They had even sort of cast themselves. I can't remember exactly who they wanted to be. It wasn't the 4 hobbits. That's what I initially had thought, but then when I was looking again for this video, I saw that one wanted to be Gandalf and the other one wanted to be Gollum, and then I think Frodo and Sam were the other 2. But they wanted to star in Lord of the Rings, and Stanley Kubrick was even interested in maybe doing the directing. But Tolkien was still alive at that point and still had all the rights and said, nope, absolutely not. There's no way. You are desecrating my life's work by making a Beatles movie out of it. I think that would have been hilarious, but I'm Team Tolkien on that one. Next, going back to Rohan, It is, as I mentioned, a very Anglo-Saxon culture, down to the language itself. Now, you know that Tolkien studied languages, he taught languages, he invented languages. It was what he obsessed over all the time. And the language that he taught in Oxford primarily was Anglo-Saxon. He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon. So even today, if you read and study Beowulf at a high level, you have to read Tolkien's criticism of it and his thoughts on this work. So he knew the language intimately, and he used a ton of it for the culture of Rohan. So a couple of examples, since I've studied Anglo-Saxon a little bit myself in my English degree-ness. So the word Theoden, even though the letter that makes the TH looks a little bit different, it's pronounced Theoden, it means king. And so Theoden king literally means king. The prefix AO, so EO, the letter is EO, so it's pronounced AO, means horse, and we see that prefix everywhere with Eowyn and Eomer and Eorl and all those AOs. So horse, all their names are related to horses. So Eowyn, for example, is Eo and then Wyn, and in Anglo-Saxon that means horse joy, so joy of horses. So yeah, if you look at it, even the name of Meduseld is kind of a variation on the Anglo-Saxon word for a mead hall, where everybody would meet together. And the way that Anglo-Saxons would refer to the earth is by calling it Middle Earth. So tons and tons of Anglo-Saxon connections there. Next on my list is that a lot of people call The Lord of the Rings a trilogy. It is not actually a trilogy, it's just one book. But when Tolkien just delivered this insane 1,200 page thing with appendices and untranslated Elvish and whatever to the publisher that he was hoping would publish it, the publisher, Allen and Unwin, decided to basically bet the farm on the genius of this book. If it had failed, then the entire publishing company would have gone under, and it continues today to be a publishing company, so that's good. But anyway, going back to how it's not a trilogy, it's one book. The reason that it was split up into 3 books is that after World War II, there was a paper shortage, and so when Fellowship of the Ring came out in 1954, I think I'm right on that, 1954, and so it was, it was almost 10 years after World War II, but obviously that was such a devastating event that there still were repercussions. So they just couldn't actually afford to print this gigantic story, and so they broke it up into 3. But Tolkien and the publishers had quite the arguments about what to call the different pieces. I think Tolkien was at peace with the Fellowship of the Ring being the first one. The Two Towers was a little less clear, but okay. Tolkien hated the name of The Return of the King because he's like, it's a spoiler. I don't want the last part of my book to be named a spoiler. Instead, he wanted it to be The War of the Ring, or something like that. So he got overruled, and so we have The Return of the King today. But originally it was just Lord of the Rings, broken up into 6 kind of sections, but they weren't meant to be published separately. It was just 6 sections. Okay, so going along with the publishing of Lord of the Rings, as I mentioned, the books were super, super popular. It took a little bit longer for them to get popular in the US, but it was only a couple of years before it just completely caught fire, and a lot of the hippie movement in the 1960s gravitated toward the lifestyle of the hobbits and the pressing back against all of this technology that's implied very, very strongly in Lord of the Rings as a theme. And so there was a demand for Lord of the Rings in America. Now, Ace Publishing decided to just publish this stuff on their own, and I found a copy of the one I'm talking about here in a used bookstore. And this was actually an illegal copy. Tolkien never signed off on the Ace edition, and he never saw any of the royalties from it either. It was a big scandal. So to this day, occasionally, if you look at the very beginning, preface or what have you, then there will be a note about how this is an authorized edition of Lord of the Rings, because this was an unauthorized edition. They sold thousands of copies, and Tolkien didn't see a dime. So I found this in a used bookstore. I did not support the bad behavior, but yeah, this one was illegal, essentially. And the cover is terrible. Just take a gander. Look at that. Who are those people? I'm not sure. All right, and then last but not least, after Lord of the Rings came out, there was Tolkien received a letter from a man named Sam Gamgee, who has these impressive, if you look up a picture, in fact, I'll look up a picture and I'll show it to you as I'm talking. So Sam Gamgee, he has these impressive mutton chops, and he sent a letter to Tolkien basically being kind of upset that his name was used in this fictional story that now is so popular that people are asking him about it. And Tolkien was absolutely delighted to hear from a Sam Gamgee, so he wrote a letter back and actually sent some signed copies of the books to him and said, actually, I think that Sam is not just a lowly gardener character, but he is the hero of the Lord of the Rings. So then he got a letter back from Mr. Gamgee saying, oh, okay, well that sounds good then. And he was all happy after that. So there you go, 10 things that you may or may not have known about Lord of the Rings for any fans out there. Don't forget to subscribe for more English nerdy goodness. Like this video if you like it, and I will see you next Monday. Bye.